Hi students, this is Mr. Yao. In the last lesson, we have learned about complex number addition and subtraction, and in this lesson, we're going to continue to learn more about complex number operation, which is multiplication. In the addition and subtraction lesson, we have learned that we can treat I just like an x. In here, the same thing, except one little extra rule. So to multiply complex number, we set it up as polynomials. The rule in here is I squared equals -1. So let's have a look at some examples. Example 1. Well, if it's -3x times 10x, you would know -3 times 10 is a -30, and then the x, you have another one, so it's x squared. Same thing here. -3 times 10 is -30. I times I is an I squared, except you have to go one extra step because I squared is a -1. So this is going to be -30 times a -1, which is a +30. Example 2. So in this case, you can't just say, oh, I'm going to multiply them and get a positive square root of 50. That's not how it works. Because you have to make sure the individual ones work before you can even multiply them. So of course, in this case, we have to treat them as a square root of -1 times square root of 10 times square root of -1 and times square root of 5. So we're going to multiply the square root of -1 and the square root of -1, which is an I and another I. And then we actually have square root of 10 times square root of 5. So together, that is square root of 50 times I squared, which is negative square root of 50, but we do need to simplify the square root of 50. That is going to be negative 5 square root of 2. There you go. Moving on, example 3. Distribute -2 times -8 is a positive 16i, and then -2i times I is -2i squared. Don't forget, this is -1. So we have 16i minus 2 times -1, which is going to be a 16i plus 2. But typically, we put the final answer in standard form, so that is going to be a 2 plus 16i. Now you might be wondering, wait, what about example 1 and 2? Like, what are the standard form for them? Well, this one doesn't even have an I, so it is just a 30. And in fact, it's a plus 0i, but we don't have to write it, so it's just a 30. Next one is the same thing. There's no I, so the number is just going to be by itself. Example 4. When we have 3 separate things, we just multiply them 2 at a time. So we're going to multiply the first 2 to get a 15i squared times -1 minus 8i. And before we even start multiplying with the parentheses, let's already simplify, because I squared, as soon as we see it, that's a -1. So this is a -15 times a -1 minus 8i. Now we can actually do our distribution. -15 times -1 is a positive 15. -15 times a -8i is a positive 120i. And that is already in standard form, number in the front, I on the back. That's example 4. Moving on. Example 5. Do our distribution. And you can totally make the box if you want to. 9 times -4 is a -36. 9 times the 7i is a 63i, and -2i times -4 is a positive 8i. -2i times the 7i is a minus 14i squared. Next, as soon as we see I squared, we can already change that. So I'm going to keep everything else, -36 plus 63i, and then 8i is a 71i. -14 times I squared is a -1, so that becomes a plus 14. Let's combine. -36 and the 14 is going to be a -22 plus 71i. And that is already in standard form. Example 6. Before we actually want to start multiplying, we need to get rid of the negative inside the square root. So we're going to need to rewrite 2 plus. This is a square root of -1 times the square root of 4. Square root of 4 is a 2. Square root of -1 is an I, so it's 2i. And then -1 plus is a -1 times square root of -1 times the square root of 9. So we have I, and square root of 9 is a 3, so it's a 3i. Let's do our distribution. 2 times -1, 2 times 3i. So it's a -2. 2 times 3i is a 6i. Then 2i times -1 is a -2i. And 2i times 3i is a 6i squared. Combine like terms. -2, stay there. 6i minus 2i is a 4i. And then 6i squared on the end. I squared is a -1, so that becomes a -6. Final answer, -8 plus 4i. There you go. That's example 6. Moving on, example 7. Same thing, just like the previous one, we're going to need to get rid of the negative roots first. This is a 5 plus I, then multiply with a 2 minus, this is a square root of negative 1 times square root of 36. Square root of 36 is a 6, so that's a 6I. And multiply. Well, I'm gonna still show since many of you would actually like to use a box. 5, a positive I, 2, a negative 6I. It's the same, like your x. So 2 times 5 is a 10, 2 times I is a 2I. Negative 6I times a 5 is a negative 30I. Negative 6I times an I is a negative 6I squared. So you can combine the i's together already. So that's going to be negative 28i on the back. As for the other two numbers, you have a 10, and then this negative 6i squared is just a negative 6 times a negative 1, which is a positive 6. So it's a 16 in the front. There you go. That's example 7. Example 8. Whenever you see a squared, get rid of it and write it twice. Negative 4 plus 3i. And choose to make a box again. Negative 4, 3i. Negative 4, 3i. So start multiplying. Negative 4 is a 16. Negative 4 times 3i is a negative 12i. 3i times negative 4 is a negative 12i. 3i times 3i is a 9i squared. And then negative 12i and negative 12i together is a negative 24i on the back. Then 9i squared, well, I squared again is a negative 1, so that will be a 9 times negative 1, which is a negative 9. So 16 minus 9 is a 7. There you go. That's example 8. Example 9. Same thing. Well, this time we do need to actually convert both of the square roots. So that is going to be a 3, and square root of negative 64 is a square root of negative 1 times square root of 64, which is a 8i. So it's 3 plus 8i times 3 minus 8i. If you forgot these two, how special these two are, well, they are conjugates because one is a positive, the other is a negative. So let's still multiply. We can use the box. 3, a positive 8i. 3, a negative 8i. That's a 9, 24i, and this is a negative 24i, and lastly, a negative 64i squared. Okay, 24i, negative 24i, they are cancelled. Negative 64i squared is a negative 64 times a negative 1, which is a positive 64. So final answer is 9 and 64 together, which is 73. So let me remind you again, whenever you multiply the conjugate, typically the middle ones are cancelled. And in this case, you can see the final answer does not even have an I, and we are going to use that in the next lesson. Okay, next, number 10. For any time you have more parentheses to multiply, you do need to deal with them 2 at a time. So let's deal with the first 2. 3 times negative 2 is a negative 6. 3 times negative 6i is a minus 18i. 4i times negative 2 is a minus 8i. 4i times a negative 6i is a negative 24i squared. Let's simplify that part first. The negative 6, the minus is an 18i, negative 18i and a negative 8i, so minus 26i. The negative 24 times I squared, which is negative 1, turned into a plus 24. That is going to give us an 18 minus 26. So the first part is 18 times minus 26i. Now let's continue. 18 minus 26i times negative 4 plus 3i. So you see, you deal with 2 of them at a time, then you continue adding the next next parentheses. Let's make a box for this one so you can see both methods. 18, negative 26i, negative 4, i. So we got a negative 72. And then it's a positive, well, I don't need to write the positive. It's a 52, no, sorry. It's 104i. 3 times 18, 54i. And then lastly, 3 times negative 26 and negative 78i squared. For all of the i's, we have 104 and 54 together. That is 158i. And then we have negative 72, and that's a negative 78 times a negative 1, which is a positive 78. So negative 72 and a positive 78 together is a 6. And that is the final answer for example 10. And that is everything for this complex number multiplication lesson. Thank you.